So what? You served coffee on base, right? My brother-in-law smirked across the Thanksgiving dinner table, spinning his wine glass with smug satisfaction. His arrogance had been building all evening, but this took the cake. I set my glass down, looking him straight in the eye. "Try again," I said softly. He let out a loud laugh, looking around the room for support. "Then what did you actually do in the Navy? Desk work? Filing reports?" I leaned forward, my voice calm, steady, and clear. "I was a Top Gun strike fighter tactics instructor." The entire room went dead silent. The smirk vanished from his face instantly. But the best part was his father, a retired Marine colonel sitting at the head of the table. He slowly set down his fork, stared at his son with pure cold fury, and rasped out 3 words. "Boy, apologize. Now." My name is Rebecca Lawson. I'm 38 years old, and if there's one thing I've learned in my life, it's that the people who boast the loudest usually have the least to back it up. I've always kept my past in the military private, preferring to let my present speak for itself. But family gatherings have a funny way of bringing out the worst in people who crave attention. That Thanksgiving, my sister introduced us to her new husband, Chad, a 32-year-old corporate consultant who talked as if he had personally conquered the business world. Within 20 minutes of sitting down, Chad had managed to bring up his high school football glory days 3 separate times. He was the kind of man who needed to be the most impressive person in every room he walked into. When the conversation turned to my time in the armed forces, Chad saw an easy target. Sitting at a table surrounded by my family, including his own father, a retired Marine colonel who sat quietly at the end of the table, Chad leaned back, picked up his wine glass, and looked at me with a smirk. He wasn't looking for a genuine conversation. He was looking to make a joke at my expense to establish his dominance. "So what? You served coffee on base, right?" he asked, chuckling at his own joke. He assumed my quiet nature meant I had nothing of substance to share. He was dead wrong. I've never been someone who wears my achievements on my sleeve. Spending 12 years in uniform teaches you that true confidence doesn't need a microphone, and real discipline speaks through actions, not words. When I left the service, I hung up my flight suit and moved on with my life, rarely bringing up my military background unless someone specifically asked. To me, it wasn't something to brag about over cocktail parties. It was a chapter of intense dedication, immense responsibility, and quiet pride. Unfortunately, Chad mistook my silence for subservience. In his narrow mind, if a woman wasn't actively boasting about her career, it meant she must have held some minor, unimportant role. He wanted to shine by comparison, and in his eyes, I was the perfect foil to make himself look like a high-powered achiever. "Come on, Rebecca," Chad continued, his smirk widening as he spun the stem of his glass. The room had gone quiet, the kind of heavy silence that settles over a dinner table when everyone knows a boundary is being crossed, but no one wants to start a scene. We all know how it goes. You do your little tour, handle some paperwork, maybe run the administrative desk, and then come back pretending to be a hero. It's okay to admit it. Not everyone can handle the heavy lifting. He looked around the table, practically begging for someone to join in on his laughter. My sister looked down, visibly embarrassed, while Chad's father, Colonel Hayes, sat completely motionless at the head of the table, his sharp eyes locked onto his son. Chad, completely oblivious to the tension he was creating, leaned forward over his plate, pressing the issue. "So tell us, Rebecca. Prove us wrong. What did you actually do in the Navy?" The room felt frozen in time. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the silence hang in the air until the smug grin on Chad's face began to waver slightly. I didn't raise my voice, nor did I show a single trace of anger. I just looked him straight in the eyes, my tone as steady as an instrument panel. "I was a strike fighter tactics instructor," I said, every word clear and precise. "At the Navy Fighter Weapons School. Top Gun. For a second, the words seemed to float over the table without sticking. Chad blinked, his eyebrows furrowing as his brain desperately tried to process what I had just said. He knew the name. Everyone knew the name. But he couldn't reconcile it with the quiet woman sitting across from him. The smug confidence drained from his expression, replaced by a sudden jarring confusion. Wait, like actual jets? He stammered, his voice losing all its boastful edge. You were an instructor. Before I could answer, the heavy scrape of a chair echoed through the dining room. Colonel Hayes was standing up, the retired Marine colonel who had spent 30 years serving his country and knew the unfathomable amount of grit, precision, and perfection required to earn a Top Gun patch, looked at his son like he was a total stranger. The color had completely left the colonel's face, replaced by a cold, thunderous fury. He didn't yell. He didn't have to. His voice came out as a low, terrifying rasp that cut through the room like a razor blade. Boy, the colonel growled, leaning over the table, his knuckles white against the wood. You set that glass down, stand up, and apologize to this woman. Now. Chad stammered, completely frozen under the weight of his father's glare, but my mind was already miles away, drifting back to Naval Air Station Fallon in Nevada. They don't hand out Top Gun patches because you asked nicely, and they certainly don't care about your ego. Out of thousands of naval aviators, only the absolute top fraction of 1% ever get selected to attend the Strike Fighter Tactics Instructor course. When I arrived at Fallon, I was flying the FA-18E Super Hornet, a $30 million lethal machine that demands absolute perfection every single second you're in the cockpit. The training was brutal. We're talking 14-hour days filled with relentless tactical briefings, grueling physical demands, and simulated air-to-air combat against the most skilled adversary pilots in the world. In a world traditionally dominated by men, I never asked for special treatment, and I never got any. Up at 15,000 feet, pulled into a 7.5 G-turn until your vision starts to narrow into a black tunnel and your heart feels like it's being crushed against your ribs. Nobody cares what your background is. All that matters is your reaction time, your situational awareness, and your tactical execution. I spent months pulling high-G maneuvers, mastering air-to-air combat tactics, and proving that I could not only outfly the best, but that I could teach others to do the same. Earning that patch wasn't just a career milestone, it was forged through blood, sweat, and sleepless nights. So sitting at a dinner table listening to a man who had never faced real pressure try to diminish my service was almost laughable. Chad practically scrambled out of his chair, his face flushing a deep, humiliated red. His cocky composure was entirely shattered, reduced to a nervous stammer. I'm sorry, Rebecca, he managed to choke out, keeping his eyes glued to the floor, completely unable to meet my gaze. I didn't know. I was just joking. A joke is supposed to be funny, son, Colonel Hayes barked, before slowly turning toward me. The thunderous anger in the old Marine's eyes instantly melted into profound, genuine respect. He sat back down, pulling his chair in, and looked at me as if seeing me clearly for the very first time. Super Hornets? The colonel asked quietly, his tone laced with reverence. Yes, sir, I replied. VFA 137 out of Lemoore initially, then 3 years instructing at Fallon. Good Lord, the colonel breathed, shaking his head in absolute awe. He turned to the rest of the table, ignoring Chad as if he were invisible. Do you all have any idea what this woman accomplished? You're sitting across from one of the most elite tactical aviators on the planet. The shift in the room was absolute. My sister stared at me with wide, astonished eyes, while Chad sat back down in total silence, shrinking into his seat like a man wishing the floor would open up and swallow him whole. Colonel Hayes leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful look coming over his face as a specific memory seemed to click into place. Wait a minute, he said, tapping a finger against the wooden table. About 5 years ago, during that incident in the South China Sea, Marine Corps Aviation was talking about a Navy instructor who intercepted two hostile fighters pulling an aggressive push on an Allied reconnaissance plane. She executed a high-aspect maneuver, held intercept geometry without firing a shot, and forced them to disengage. He looked up, his eyes sharp and wide. "That was you, wasn't it?" I gave a small, humble nod. "It was a routine intercept, Colonel. We just executed our training." "Routine?" The colonel let out a short, incredulous laugh. "They wrote tactical debriefs about that engagement across 3 branches. You saved a multi-million-dollar asset and avoided a major international crisis through pure flying skill." Chad was staring at me now, his mouth slightly open in sheer disbelief. The woman he had accused of serving coffee and handling paperwork had literally stood on the edge of combat, operating a high-performance jet at supersonic speeds while making life-or-death tactical decisions. He realized in that moment that he wasn't just sitting next to his quiet sister-in-law. He was sitting next to someone who possessed lethal skill, extreme mental discipline, and the absolute respect of high-ranking military leaders like his own father. The silence from his side of the table was absolute. That Thanksgiving dinner marked a permanent shift in our family dynamic. For the rest of the evening, Chad didn't say another word about his high school football days, nor did he make a single condescending remark to anyone at the table. In fact, every time I looked in his direction, he quickly looked away, thoroughly humbled by the lesson his own father had forced him to learn. In the months that followed, Colonel Hayes and I developed a wonderful friendship, spending hours talking about aviation, military history, and leadership. As for Chad, he learned the hard way that quiet people aren't weak, and true strength never needs to shout to be heard. Leaving the military was one of the hardest decisions of my life, but transitioning to civilian life taught me that our accomplishments belong to us, whether the world knows about them or not. True confidence is knowing who you are and what you've built without needing validation from people who haven't walked in your boots. Now, I'm curious about you, who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever had to put an arrogant relative in their place? Comment below with the city you are watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. Thank you for watching until the end.